People watching is a favorite pastime of mine. I think it's probably a favorite of a lot of you also. It's a pleasure to go to different situations and just sit there and watch people. And when they especially don't know you, especially when they don't know you're watching them. It's a great sport to go people watching, and we really all enjoy it. A good place to go people watching is really here in church, especially during Holy Communion. And I realize that those of you are supposed to be serious and spiritual during Holy Communion. But a whole bunch of you are sitting there people watching. You sit as people who are sitting here in the front, they have a distinct advantage because you can watch everyone who walks by you. And as the pastor, well, I have the best view because I'm the closest to the people who are kneeling. And I can watch their joys, the loving gestures between a man and a woman, a mother's caress of her child, holding hands, arm holding, and the beaming smiles that many have. Our gospel story for today is a people watching story. And we have to get into the mood of people watching in order to really enjoy this story. First, I would like to tell you about the setting here. The Bible tells us that Jesus was teaching in the temple. Now, the temple was by far the most magnificent building around. It was the spiritual center of the Jewish religious life. But the temple was also their social center. It was like a large marketplace where everyone sold their goods and their wares also. And if you wanted a really good time, you went to the temple where all the people gathered. And Jesus had been there at the temple all day that day. He'd been arguing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And Jesus was tired out, and so he came over and he sat down on a bench near the side of the wall, such as you would sit on in a bench in a museum up against the wall there. And it was a great place now for people watching. Now, from my study, on one wall of the temple, there would be 13 offering boxes. 13 of them. They were big metal boxes, and there was a slit in the top of the box so that people could come and they could place their offering through that slit in the box. There were little signs on each of the boxes. Building maintenance, utilities, rabbi salary, widows and orphans, and on they went. There were 13 different line items that you could give your offering for. And this room was absolutely jammed with people. Now, about that time, especially in my imagination, he came riding into the temple on the best camel that you have ever seen. He was lovely. He was dressed in purple and the very finest silk. And by looking at him, and he wanted you to look at him, you could tell that he was elegantly rich. With a gold necklace around his neck, with gold rings, a gold bracelet. And you could tell a man by his sandals. And this man had the very best sandals that you've ever seen. And he walks up to the center of the building, and everyone watches when he pulls out his money. And when he pulled out his money, everyone knew that this was not going to be a nickel, dime, or dollar stuff. This was a big-time giver. He promptly walks over to the offering boxes, and he drops his in the slot. Fire. Jesus and his disciples, they were sitting there watching. Jesus nudged his disciples a little bit, sort of like some of you wives do with your husbands. Nudged them a little bit and just smiled at them. Then this Jewish rabbi entered the temple. And you could tell that he was religious now. He had those long curls right on the side of his face, because a good Jew never cuts those all his life. He wore a long black beard. He had a matching long black robe with black onyx rings on his fingers. He was wearing black leather sandals with a matching black skull hat on his head. And he carried this big black scroll with him. And this pious man came strolling into the temple with this prayerful look on his face. He looked religious. He glanced around and he saw that the people weren't watching him. And so he pulled out 10 large silver coins that he knew that they would make a large clank when he dropped them in the offering plate. And then he very slowly and very distinctly, clank, 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 clank. And by the third or fourth clank now, everybody's watching him. Jesus pulls his friends again. They all smiled as they're watching him. Well, then came in this little old lady. No one noticed her. She was almost invisible to the busy, noisy crowd that was gathered there. She was obviously poor. She looked like an old washerwoman. She was an old woman who walked slowly, like she had some arthritic pain. She had a cane in her hand, feeling the floor as she approached the offering boxes. And into a box, she dropped 2 small coins. They were worth less than a penny. Jesus whispered to his friends as they sat quietly there on that bench. Did you see what that little old lady over there did? She gave her last penny. Those other people gave from their abundance. But that little old lady gave from the abundance of her heart. She gave everything that she had. Well, this is what happened one day. Jesus was out people watching in the temple. The little old lady in the model is the model of the Bible now of a person who is generous. She is one of 4 who are in the New Testament who are examples of what it means to give generously. First, there is Zacchaeus. Remember the little short man who defrauded everybody? Jesus came to his house, and Jesus got into his heart. Zacchaeus then announced that he would repay everyone double the amount that he had stolen from them. And then he would give half of his goods to the poor. Zacchaeus gave way beyond now what the law required of him. That's what happens when Jesus gets into your heart. The second example was Barnabas in the book of Acts, who sold his property and he gave the proceeds to a widow. He was more generous than the Old Testament law required of him. The third example of enormous generosity was the church in Macedonia. This congregation is described in 2 Corinthians, the 8th and the 9th chapters. And the words enormously generous or rich in generosity are repeated at least 5 times in this passage. And the widow who gave her 2 pennies, all that she had, is the fourth example of enormous generosity in the New Testament. Now, what was this little old lady's name? Do you remember? Of all the people in the Bible, and the Bible certainly would have recorded her name, wouldn't it? What was her name? The Bible doesn't even bother to tell us. She's one of the most generous givers in the whole Bible, who gives in all ways. And the Bible doesn't even tell us what her name was. We know the name of Zacchaeus and of Barnabas in the church of Macedonia, but we don't know this little lady's name. So I'm going to call her Hannah. Hannah. The question today is this: why was Hannah such a generous giver? Hannah had 4 qualities now, and those 4 qualities are the marks of a generous person. First, Hannah knew the Lord. She had a personal relationship with God. She was involved with daily prayer, with daily cleansing, and a daily walk with her Lord. Hannah didn't merely believe in the existence of a God. She was a living relationship is what she had with God. She first gave herself to God. You cannot be a generous giver if you have not given yourself to God first. That's what Hannah did. And that was why she was such a generous giver. The Old Testament understands this. The faithful Jews gave their first fruits, their first lambs, because they had first given their hearts to God. The way we give offerings reveals our hearts. You ever thought of it that way? And God knows the inner hearts of all of us, including Hannah. Why was Hannah such a generous giver? Because, like all generous givers, she first gave her heart to the Lord. A second reason that I believe Hannah was so generous was that she realized how abundantly generous that God had been with her. Hannah had experienced the generosity of God. She knew that everything that she had, and it wasn't very much, but in the eyes of the world it was nothing. But she knew that it was a gift from God. The Hannahs of life know that everything is a gift from God. Our abilities with which we make our money, our brains, our work habits, our health, our good fortune, our abilities to to make a decent income. The Hannahs of life know this. But if you are walking around with the feeling in your heart that everything that you have is mine, that everything I have earned it with my abilities, with my work, with my good fortune, with my good work habits, the chances are you are not like Hannah. She knew deeply that everything she had was a gift from God. Now, the third reason that Hannah was so generous was that she was a mature religious person. She wasn't a beginner. She wasn't a shallow believer. She wasn't a novice. She was a mature follower of the ways of the Lord. I have personally noticed that again and again, it is the mature Christians who are the generous Christians. By nature, I mean that they walk with God, they talk with God, they know their Bibles, and they give of themselves in so many ways to our Lord and to other people. There is maturity in their discipleship. There is this depth of piety. There is this depth of prayer, a depth of commitment to Christ and to His ways. Their Christianity is not a Sunday-only Christianity. It is not a fair-weather Christianity. It is not a habit Christianity that somehow they inherited from their parents. I don't have to tell Hannah, or you don't have to tell Hannah what the Bible teaches about money, because Hannah already knows what God wants, what God teaches in the Bible. She knows what is in the Bible, and she lives according to her Bible, regarding her family life, her prayer life, and her marriage life. Fourth, Hannah knows that she will have more than enough to meet her own needs after she has given her offering. You don't have to tell Hannah that. You never have to say to Hannah, Hannah, you know, after you give your generous offering, you're going to have more than enough to meet your needs. You don't have to tell Hannah, because she has lived that kind of life for so many years. You know, it's interesting that in my 40 years of parish ministry, I have never, ever met a generous giver who complained about a lack of food or clothing or the basic necessities of life. Never. In conclusion, I have two questions. One question is very easy. The other question is not so easy. The first question is easy. Why was Hannah so generous? Now the hard question. What would it take for you and me